She heard scratching at her door in the dark. She opened it and found 4 pairs of eyes staring up at her. They were not the eyes of village strays or wild foxes. They were the silver gray of a winter sky just before a storm, the color of the royal bloodline, the Alpha King's cubs. 4 of them, no older than 2 winters, their dark fur matted with burrs and smelling of damp earth and fear. They stood huddled together on her doorstep, a small, shivering island in the vast, hostile dark of the exiled lands. Alara's breath caught in her throat, a sharp, painful thing. She had been cast out from the capital, stripped of her name and rank, sent to this forgotten village at the edge of the known world, to live and die in obscurity. The accusation had been treason of the heart, a quiet defiance the king's council could not tolerate. Now, the king's own heart, his legacy, was shivering on her threshold. She should have slammed the door. She should have sent them running back into the woods, back toward the capital that was a week's hard journey from here. It was the safe thing to do, the only sane thing. To be found with them would not be seen as sanctuary. It would be seen as kidnapping. It would be a death sentence, swift and merciless. But the smallest of the 4, a female with a nick in her left ear, let out a soft, whimpering sound that was not the growl of a future alpha, but the cry of a lost child. Ilara's hand, which had been gripping the doorframe so tightly her knuckles were white, relaxed. The wound of her exile was a cold, hard stone in her chest, but it had not extinguished everything. She looked past them, into the oppressive black of the forest that pressed in on her small cottage, and saw nothing, heard nothing but the wind. They were alone, unclaimed, her jaw tightened. She stepped back, opening the door wider. The warmth from her hearth, smelling of pine smoke and drying herbs, spilled out into the cold night. The cubs flinched from the light, but the scent of warmth drew them forward. One by one, hesitant and wary, they padded across her threshold, their small claws making soft clicking sounds on the worn floorboards. The sound of a heavy wooden door closing, the bolt sliding home. The sound was final. It was the sound of a line being crossed, a choice from which there was no retreat. She looked at the 4 small, wild things now standing in the center of her one-room life, their silver eyes tracking her every move. They were the children of the man who had ruined her, and she had just locked the world out to keep them safe. For 3 days, the palace did not notice they were gone. The royal nursery was a vast, sprawling wing of the stone fortress, filled with attendants and tutors and guards who were so accustomed to the quiet obedience of the king's children that their absence was mistaken for good behavior. It was a failure of diligence born from years of unquestioned security. In her cottage, Alara learned their natures. The eldest male, Rorik, was a shadow of his father, watchful, silent, with a stillness that was unnerving in one so young. The second, a female named Lyra, was the boldest, the first to approach her for a piece of dried meat, the first to nudge a cold nose against her hand. The third, Call, was the most cautious, hiding behind his siblings, his eyes wide with a constant, simmering anxiety. And then there was Seren, the smallest with the nicked ear, who seemed to carry a sadness too old for her small body. Alara had little to offer them. She was an exile, living on what she could hunt, trap, and grow in her small garden plot. But she butchered her last salted hog, stewing the tough meat for hours until it was soft enough for their young teeth. She shared her own meager rations of bread and goat cheese. She sat by the fire at night, stitching a tear in Rorik's tunic, a fine velvet garment completely at odds with her rough-spun world, while they slept in a heap on her only spare blanket. They did not speak, not in the way of men. They communicated in glances, in the subtle shifts of their posture, in the low rumbles in their chests that she was beginning to understand. They were not human children. They were something more, something older, and they were beginning to look at her with something other than fear. It was a fragile, dangerous trust. She knew it could not last. On the fourth day, a trader passed through the village, his wagon wheels groaning under the weight of city goods. He spoke of unease in the capital. The king, he said, had not been seen for 2 days. A quiet panic was beginning to thread its way through the court. Lord Valerius, the king's first advisor, the man whose veiled accusations had been the catalyst for her exile, was maintaining order. Alara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Kalen was not a man to hide. His presence was the bedrock of the kingdom. If he was missing, it was because he was looking for something. She watched the cubs that evening as they wrestled on the floor, their play a silent, deadly serious pantomime of dominance and submission. Their silver eyes flashed in the firelight. They were his blood, his future. And the world was about to come looking for them. The routine she had fallen into was a fragile sort of peace, a lie she told herself in the quiet hours between sunset and sunrise. She would rise before the dawn, the 4 small bodies on the hearth a warm, breathing weight in the stillness of her home. She would move about her chores and they would follow, a silent 4-cub procession. Lyra would try to help, proudly carrying a single piece of kindling in her mouth. Rorik would sit and watch, his expression unnervingly judicious as if he were judging her methods. Kyle and Seren would remain close, their presence a constant, soft pressure against her legs. They were growing accustomed to the scent of her. Wood smoke, dried herbs, and the faint metallic tang of loneliness. She was growing accustomed to the scent of them. Clean earth, young fur, and the untouchable cold of the mountains from which their bloodline sprang. There were moments that broke through her guard. One afternoon, while she was tending her garden, pulling the last of the tough-rooted carrots from the soil, Lyra dropped a dead field mouse at her feet, looking up at her with an expression of profound, unblinking pride. It was a gift, an offering. Alara had stared at the small, limp body, her throat tight. She had not been given a gift in 5 years. She had picked it up, her fingers gentle, and thanked the cub with a quiet murmur and a scratch behind the ears. The gesture felt foreign, an echo of a life she no longer lived. Another time, in the dead of night, she woke from a familiar nightmare, the cold, dismissive look in the king's eyes as he pronounced her sentence, to find Seren whimpering in her sleep. Alara had moved from her cot to the hearth and gathered the small cub into her arms, rocking her gently, humming a tuneless, forgotten lullaby until the trembling subsided. The act was pure instinct, a response so deeply buried she hadn't known it was still there. She was becoming attached. The realization was a sharp, physical pain, like a knife twisting in the old wound of her exile. This attachment was a weakness. It was a chain she was forging for her own execution. In the capital, the quiet panic had curdled into a tightly controlled state of alarm. On the 7th day, the king emerged. He had personally torn the royal nursery apart, his rage a cold, silent storm that left his entire staff trembling. He had found the tracks, faint, days old, but unmistakable. 4 small sets of prints leading away from the palace walls, toward the wild, untamed lands to the east. toward the exiles. Lord Valerius had advised sending the royal guard, a legion of his most elite trackers. The king had refused. This was not a matter for soldiers. This was a matter for a father. He would go himself, alone. The news traveled on the wind. A rumor whispered from outpost to outpost, finally reaching Alara's village through a nervous patrolman seeking shelter for the night. The king was coming, not with an army, just him. The thought was more terrifying than any army. An army could be seen, heard, prepared for. Kalen was a force of nature. He would not be loud. He would simply arrive. The air changed first. It grew heavy, charged with the scent of ozone and distant snow. The birds in the forest fell silent. The squirrels vanished. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Ilara was outside, splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of her axe the only sound, in a world that had gone unnervingly still. The cubs were nearby, chasing a beetle through the dirt, but they too stopped, their heads lifting in unison, their small noses testing the air. They smelled him before she did. The scent that finally reached her was one she had spent 5 years trying to forget. Cold stone, pine needles, and the unyielding authority of a king. It was the scent of power. She straightened slowly, her hand tight on the axe handle. It was a pathetic weapon against what was coming, but it was all she had. She did not have to wait long. He emerged from the tree line at the edge of her clearing, not with a crash, but with a fluid, silent grace that was more predatory than any sound. He was just as she remembered, yet more so. Taller, broader, the lines of his face carved deeper by solitude and rule. He wore simple black leathers, a longsword strapped to his back, its pommel a dull, unadorned silver. His eyes, that same impossible winter gray as his children's, found her instantly. They were not angry. They were worse. They were cold, empty, and absolute. He did not move. He simply stood there, his presence a physical weight pressing down on the clearing, on her, on the very air she was trying to breathe. The cubs did not run to him. That was the first thing that struck her, the first crack in the frozen tableau. They scrambled behind her, peering out from the folds of her worn skirt, their small bodies trembling. Rorik, the eldest, even let out a low, uncertain growl, a sound of warning directed at his own sire. Kalen's eyes flickered from her to the children at her feet, and for a fraction of a second, something shifted in their depths. It was not surprise. It was a profound, soul-deep shock, so quickly masked it might never have been there at all. He had expected to find them captive. He had expected to find them terrified. He had not expected to find them defended. He took a single, deliberate step forward. Omega, he said. Her old designation. Not her name. It was a reminder of her station, of his, of the chasm that lay between them. His voice was a low rumble, the sound of stones grinding together deep underground. She did not answer. She stood her ground, the axe held loosely at her side. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her face was a mask of calm she had perfected in her exile. He took another step. He was close enough now that she could see the flecks of silver in his dark hair, the faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He was no longer just a king, a symbol. He was a man, a dangerously powerful one. "They are mine," he stated. It was not a question. It was a fact. The foundation of his world. "They were hungry," she replied, her own voice startlingly steady. "And they were alone." Her words hung in the charged air between them. It was not an excuse. It was an explanation, and in its simplicity, It was an accusation. You left them alone. You let them hunger. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering along the hard line of it. He had come here for a confrontation, for a reckoning. He had come prepared to dispense justice, to reclaim what was his. He had not come prepared for this quiet, unyielding woman with his children hiding at her back. The standoff stretched, a silent battle of wills fought across 10 feet of packed earth. And then, the sky, which had been holding its breath along with the forest, finally broke. A low rumble of thunder echoed from the mountains, and the first cold drop of rain struck Alara's cheek. The rain came down, not as a drizzle, but as a deluge, a solid gray sheet of water that turned the clearing to mud in moments. It plastered Alara's hair to her face and soaked her tunic through, the cold seeping into her bones. The cubs whined, pressing closer against her. Kalen did not flinch. He stood in the downpour, as if he were carved from the same stone as the mountains he ruled, the water running in rivulets down his face and over the dark leather of his tunic. But the storm had broken the spell. He could not stand there forever, and she could not leave his children to freeze in the rain. Without a word, she turned, herding the cubs before her toward the cottage. She did not look back to see if he was following. She knew he was. His presence was a certainty, a fixed point in the chaos of the storm. Inside, the small space felt impossibly smaller with him in it. He filled it, his sheer size and the aura of command that clung to him, seeming to press the very walls outward. He stood by the door he had just closed, water dripping from him onto the floorboards, creating a dark, spreading pool. He was a piece of the wild storm she had just let inside. Alara ignored him. It was a deliberate, calculated act of defiance. She moved to the hearth, stoking the fire until it blazed, the sudden warmth a welcome relief. She took her spare blanket, the one the cubs had claimed as their own, and began to dry them, one by one, her movements efficient and sure. Lyra licked her hand in gratitude. Seren curled into her lap, a small, warm weight of complete trust. Kalen watched. His silence was not empty. It was observant, analytical. He watched the way her hands were gentle but firm. He watched the way the cubs responded to her, with an ease and familiarity that spoke of days, not hours. He saw the worn but clean state of their royal clothes, the healthy sheen on their fur, the absence of fear in their eyes when they looked at her. Everything he was seeing contradicted the narrative that had been constructed for him by his council, by Lord Valerius. He had been told she was bitter, resentful, a potential threat, a woman who might use his children for revenge. He was looking at a woman who had given his children her only blanket. The storm raged outside, the wind howling around the eaves of the small cottage, the rain drumming a relentless rhythm on the roof. They were trapped, a king and his exile, in a room no bigger than a prison cell, with the 4 small reasons for their conflict sleeping by the fire. Alara finally finished with the cubs and rose, moving to the other side of the room to a small basin of water. She was intensely aware of his gaze on her back. It felt like a physical touch, a heavy, probing weight. She began to wash the garden dirt from her hands, her movements measured. "They should have been watched," she said, her voice quiet but clear over the sound of the storm. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, as cold and hard as the rain outside. He did not reply immediately. The silence stretched, filled only by the fire and the storm. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, stripped of its royal command. They were. It was a quiet admission of failure, of a trust betrayed. It was more than she had ever expected to hear from him. She turned from the basin, drying her hands on a piece of rough cloth. She met his eyes across the room. The cold emptiness was gone, replaced by something more complex, something shadowed and weary. For the first time, she saw not the Alpha King who had exiled her, but a father who had lost his children and just found them again, in a place he never expected, with a person he had been taught to despise. The air between them was thick with all the things they could not say, with the history that lay like a blade between them. And the storm showed no signs of stopping. The night wore on, an eternity in a single room. Ilara made a simple meal of broth and stale bread, setting a bowl for him on the small rickback table without a word. He ate, his movements economical and precise, his eyes never leaving her for long. The storm was a constant, roaring presence, sealing them in, forcing a proximity that was more intimate than any touch. Sometime after midnight, Kyle, the anxious one, began to cough. At first, it was a small, dry sound, but it soon deepened into a wet, rasping bark that shook his small frame. He grew restless, his breathing shallow and quick. Ilara was at his side instantly, her hand on his forehead. He was burning with fever. She rose and went to the collection of herbs hanging from the rafters. Her fingers, sure and practiced, found what she needed: willow bark for the fever, mullein for the lungs, chamomile to soothe him. She worked quickly, crushing the dried leaves and roots with a stone pestle, the familiar, earthy scents filling the small space. Kalen was suddenly there, at her shoulder, his presence a wall of heat and power. "What is it?" he asked, his voice a low growl of concern. "A lung fever," she replied, not looking up from her work. "The damp and the cold have settled in his chest. He's the weakest of the four." She added hot water to the crushed herbs, the steam rising to carry the potent aroma. She strained the liquid through a piece of clean cloth into a small wooden bowl. When she turned, Kalen was kneeling by his son's side, his large, calloused hand resting on the cub's heaving flank. The gesture was so unguarded, so deeply paternal, it momentarily stole her breath. He looked up at her, his face stark in the flickering firelight. "What do you need?" She knelt beside him, the bowl in her hands. "Hold his head. He won't want to take this." Together, they coaxed the bitter medicine into the sick cub. Kalen's hands, which could wield a sword and break a man, were impossibly gentle as he cradled his son's head. Her fingers brushed against his as she tilted the bowl to the cub's lips. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her, a current of heat that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the first time they had touched in 5 years. The last time had been when his guards had taken her arms to lead her away from the throne room. For hours they kept vigil. They worked in a silent, shared rhythm, bathing Kale's face with cool water, forcing more of the herbal tea down his throat, murmuring soft, meaningless words of comfort. The king and the exile, united in a single, desperate purpose. The rigid lines of their enmity began to blur. He saw her knowledge, her quiet competence, the fierce, protective tenderness she showed his son. She saw the raw fear beneath his iron control, the vulnerability of a father terrified of losing his child. Sometime before dawn, the fever broke. Kyle's breathing eased, the rasping sound softening into a deep, even rhythm. He was asleep, truly asleep. The crisis passed. Ilara sagged with relief, the tension of the long night draining from her. Kalen did not move. He remained kneeling by his son, his head bowed, one hand still resting on the cub's back. Silence, but for the crackle of the fire and the sound of soft rain. The storm had lessened, its fury spent. The silence that settled in the cottage was different now. It was not the hostile, charged silence of before. It was a shared, weary stillness, a truce. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and quiet. A pale, watery sunlight filtered through the single window of the cottage, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Kyle was sleeping peacefully, curled between two of his siblings. The immediate danger was over. Kalen could leave now. He could take his children and walk back out of her life, and everything would return to the way it was. But he did not move. He sat at her small table, a mug of now cold herbal tea untouched before him. Ilara stood by the window, watching the sun rise over the wet, glistening trees. The silence stretched, but it was a thoughtful silence now, a space for words that had been impossible before. "Why?" he asked. His voice was quiet, stripped of its regal authority. It was simply the voice of a man. "Why did you not send them back?" She did not turn to look at him. She kept her eyes on the horizon. "To where?" she asked, her voice just as quiet. "To a palace that did not know they were gone? To the woods? To be hunted by wolves or taken by a winter storm? They are children. It does not matter whose they are." There was no accusation in her tone, only a simple, unassailable truth. It was the truth he had been avoiding, the truth that his own fortress, his own people, had failed his children in a way this lone, exiled woman had not. He was silent for a long time. She could feel his gaze on her, a careful, searching wait. "The council said you were a threat," he finally said, the words costing him something. "Lord Valerius was most adamant. He said you harbored a traitor's heart, that your defiance in the throne room was proof of it." Ilara finally turned to face him. A bitter, humorless smile touched her lips. "My defiance was to say that a treaty built on a lie would not hold. I was right. It broke within a year. Valerius simply could not abide a woman, an Omega, questioning his counsel in front of his king." She held his gaze, letting him see the 5 years of cold fury she had kept, banked like coals. "You did not exile a traitor, Your Majesty. You exiled a truth-teller because the truth was inconvenient." The title was a deliberate sting of irony. He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his shoulders. He had the grace to look away, his eyes falling to the sleeping forms of his children by the fire. He had built his reign on strength and unwavering judgment. He was beginning to understand that his judgment in her case had been not only wrong, but manipulated. "Their mother died birthing Serene," he said, his voice low and rough. It was a confession, an explanation for the void in his home, in his heart. "The palace has been quiet since then. Too quiet. I did not see how that quiet had become neglect." He was not asking for her pity. He was offering her a piece of his own brokenness, a glimpse into the isolation of the man beneath the crown. He was showing her the wound he carried. She saw it. And in that moment, she understood that his exile had been a gilded cage, just as hers had been a literal one. They were two sides of the same solitary coin. The chasm between them was still there, a history of pain and injustice. But, for the first time, a bridge of understanding, fragile as a spider's thread, was being spun across it. The fragile peace of the morning was shattered by a sound from the world outside. The crisp, authoritative rap of knuckles on her door. It was not a villager's knock. It was the sound of the capital. Ilara's blood went cold. Kalen was on his feet in an instant, his entire posture transformed, the weary father vanishing and the Alpha King returning in his place. He moved to the door, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He did not open it. "Who is it?" he commanded, his voice a low thunder that vibrated through the small cottage. "A message for the king," came a smooth, cultured voice from the other side. "From Lord Valerius." Kalen's eyes met Alara's across the room. She saw the flicker of understanding, the instant recognition of the game being played. Valerius had not sent the royal guard because that would be a direct challenge to the king's command. He had sent a messenger, a political move, subtle, precise, and utterly deadly. Kalen opened the door. The man standing on her threshold was dressed in the impeccable gray and silver livery of the king's first advisor. He was unarmed, his hands empty, his expression one of polite, deferential concern. But his eyes, when they flickered past the king to Alara and the cubs by the fire, were cold and sharp with calculation. He bowed low. "Your Majesty." Lord Valerius was overcome with concern. "When you did not return, he dispatched scouts to follow your trail. We are relieved to find you and the royal children safe." The words were perfect. Each one was a carefully chosen weapon. "We are relieved to find you," implying he had been in danger, and the royal children, linking them to that same fabricated danger, safe, implying they had been unsafe before. He was painting a picture for anyone who might be listening, for the history that would be written. The king, in his righteous fury, tracking the kidnapper of his heirs to her den and rescuing them. The messenger held out a sealed scroll. "Lord Valerius sends his urgent counsel. He believes the Omega should be detained and brought back to the capital for questioning. He fears what influence she may have had on the children, what treason she may have planted in their minds." It was a masterstroke of political assassination. He was using Kalen's own past judgment against him, forcing him to either admit he had been wrong about Alara from the beginning or to follow the logical path Valerius had laid out for him and condemn her now. He was trapping his king in his own law. Kalen did not take the scroll. He looked from the messenger's impassive face to Alara. She stood by the hearth, her expression unreadable, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. He saw not a kidnapper or a traitor. He saw the woman who had kept his children warm, the woman who had sat up all night to nurse his son back from a fever, the woman who had spoken a hard truth 5 years ago and been punished for it. He saw the trap Valerius had laid, not just for her, but for him. A trap designed to keep him isolated, to keep him reliant on his advisor's counsel, to keep him from trusting his own eyes. A cold, quiet rage began to build in him, a rage far more dangerous than the hot fury he had felt in the nursery. He turned his gaze back to the messenger. "Tell Lord Valerius," he said, his voice deceptively soft, "that I have the situation under control. Tell him his counsel is unnecessary." He took a deliberate step to the side, allowing the messenger a clear view of the cottage's interior, of the sleeping cubs, safe and warm, of Alara standing not as a prisoner, but as a guardian. "And tell him," Kalen continued, his voice dropping lower, colder, "that I am extending an invitation to the Omega Alara to return to the capital as my guest." The messenger's carefully constructed composure finally cracked. A flicker of disbelief, of panic, crossed his face before he could mask it. He had delivered a threat and received a proclamation. He had come to see an exile arrested and was now witness to her elevation. Kalen smiled, a thin, predatory curve of his lips. "You are dismissed." The messenger bowed, his movements stiff and retreated, his mission a catastrophic failure. A door closing, this time not with a sound of finality, but of decision. Kaelin turned back to Alara. The king was gone again. It was just the man, his eyes holding hers, the air crackling with the choice he had just made. He had not consulted her. He had not asked. He had made a declaration, a royal decree on her doorstep, rearranging her life as easily as he might move a piece on a game board. The old resentment flared, hot and familiar. She had built this small, hard life for herself, a life of self-sufficiency where she answered to no one. He had no right to dismantle it with a single sentence. "You will not command me," she said, her voice low and tight with defiance. "I am not one of your subjects to be summoned at your whim." He did not rise to the challenge. He simply watched her, his gray eyes patient, seeing the fear and the pride warring within her. He took a step toward her, then another, until he stood before her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. The sheer size of him was overwhelming, but there was no threat in his posture. "It was not a command," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. It was a request, and it was an apology. The word hung in the air between them. Apology, it was a word kings did not use, a word Kaelin had likely never spoken in his life. It stripped him of his crown, of his power, leaving him bare. "I was wrong," he said, the admission a raw, difficult thing. "I listened to a man who values power over truth. I broke my own law, the one that says justice must be blind. My justice with you was not blind. It was deaf. I did not listen." He looked past her to the 4 cubs still sleeping by the fire, a soft, tangled heap of dark fur. "You have shown my children a care they have not known since their mother died. You have protected them when their own father and their own kingdom failed to. I am asking you to come back, not as an exile, not as an omega, but as you." It was more than a reversal of her sentence. It was a plea. He was asking her to re-enter a world that had viciously cast her out, to face the vipers in his court, to stand in the shadow of the throne that had been the instrument of her suffering. He was asking her to trust him, to trust that the man standing before her now was not the same king who had sent her away 5 years ago. Her entire being screamed at her to refuse, to cling to the safety of her isolation, to the cold, hard independence she had earned with her own pain. But then she looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the profound, aching loneliness in his eyes, the same loneliness that had been her constant companion for 5 years. She saw the man who had held his sick son's head with infinite gentleness, the man who had just publicly defied his most powerful advisor for her. Rorik stirred in his sleep, letting out a soft noise, and Kaelin's eyes immediately went to him, a flicker of paternal instinct that was as unconscious as breathing. That was the man he was asking her to trust, not the king, the father. Her hands, which had been clenched into fists, slowly uncurled. The anger, the fear, the years of carefully nurtured bitterness began to recede, leaving behind a terrifying, empty space, a space for a new choice. "The court will eat you alive," she whispered. It was not a refusal. It was a warning, a hint of acceptance. A small smile touched his lips, the first genuine one she had ever seen. It transformed his harsh features, revealing a warmth she had never imagined was there. "Let them try," he said. "They will find I am no longer dining alone." The choice was made, not with a grand declaration, but in the quiet space between them, a silent agreement to walk into the fire together. The journey back was a quiet affair. Kaelin had sent the messenger's horse away, and they traveled on foot at a pace the cubs could manage. It was a slow, deliberate procession through the autumn woods. The world seemed different, the colors sharper, the air cleaner. Or perhaps it was she who was different. The children acted as a constant bridge between them. Lyra would run ahead, then dart back to nudge Alara's hand before running to her father's side. Kyle, fully recovered, walked close to Kaelin, his small hand often finding its way into his father's larger one. Rorik and Seren flanked Alara, their silent, watchful presence a comfort rather than a burden. They did not speak much. There was no need. They walked in a shared silence that was no longer fraught with tension, but filled with a nascent, unspoken understanding. He would point out the track of a deer. She would identify a medicinal herb growing by the path. They were learning the landscape of each other's knowledge, mapping the quiet territories of their minds. When they finally saw the capital, its gray stone towers rising against the sky, Alara's steps faltered. The fortress was not a home to her. It was a tomb, a place of humiliation and loss. Kaelin stopped beside her, his gaze steady on her face. He didn't offer empty reassurances. He simply stood with her, a solid, unwavering presence, until she was ready to walk again. Their arrival was not triumphant. There were no trumpets, no grand announcement. They entered through a small private gate, avoiding the main court. But news traveled fast. By the time they reached the royal wing, the whispers had already begun. Lord Valerius was there, waiting for them in the grand corridor, flanked by two of his loyal councilmen. He had arranged his face into a mask of solemn relief, but his eyes, when they fell on Alara walking beside the king, were chips of obsidian. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice smooth as oiled silk. "The court rejoices at your safe return." Kaelin did not stop walking. He did not even slow his pace. He simply looked at his first advisor as he passed, a single long look that held no heat, no anger, only the cold, final promise of a reckoning to come. Valerius's smile faltered. For the first time, he looked uncertain. He looked like a man who had overplayed his hand and was only now realizing the game was over. They did not go to the throne room. They went to the nursery. It was a vast, cold chamber, filled with expensive toys and empty of warmth. The attendants who rushed forward, bowing and scraping, were dismissed with a single, sharp gesture from the king. And then they were alone, just the six of them, in the room where the failure had begun. The cubs, seeming to sense they were home, explored the familiar space, but they kept returning to Alara and Kaelin, as if to reassure themselves they were both still there. Alara stood in the center of the room, feeling like a ghost. This was the heart of the life she had been denied, the world she had been cast out from. Kaelin came to stand beside her. He looked around the opulent room with a deep dissatisfaction. "This will have to change," he said, more to himself than to her. He then looked down at her, his expression serious. "This is not your prison," he said quietly. "This is your domain, if you will have it." He was offering her a place, not just in his palace, but in his life and in the lives of his children. He was offering her a home. She looked from his earnest face to the cubs, who had finally settled onto a large fur rug, their play winding down as sleep began to claim them. Rorik was watching them, his silver-gray eyes solemn and knowing. She knelt down, and he crawled into her lap, resting his head against her chest with a contented sigh. The gesture was one of complete belonging. Here, in the heart of her old pain, she had found a new purpose. She looked up at Kalen, who was watching them, a soft, unguarded expression on his face. The silence in the room was no longer the silence of loneliness or tension. It was the silence of a beginning, a deep, quiet, and hard-won stillness.